At the heart of education is this idea that we're looking to build relationships through collaborative processes.
Okay, so welcome to the first of, hopefully, a series of podcasts run by the School of Education and Childhood. For a number of reasons, we're looking at running a learning and teaching media channel, which is to capture sort of best practice, innovative ideas across the institution. But this particular podcast is focusing on the reward and reflection project that we started back in, I think, 2022, 2023, and based upon the outcomes of that, of that project. So just to introduce ourselves, obviously, my name is James Hazzard. I'm obviously Director of Learning and Teaching for the School of Education and Childhood. And with me I have Clay Johnson, who is Digital Learning Manager for CBL, and Ellis Turner, who is a Senior Lecturer in Environmental Health in the School of Health and Social Wellbeing. So just to give a brief context as to why we're doing this, the R&R project was a pilot that you guys volunteered to become involved in back in 2022. And the idea was to bring people together within the academic community who weren't familiar with one another's practice from different subject areas, different program areas, and to allow them the autonomy and freedom to engage in a pedagogic project. That's something that they hadn't gone into with the pre-planned notions. It was an exploratory piece of action research that we were hoping to get some sort of rich data, some new learning and teaching strategies. And today is really just to unpick your experiences in doing that and to share some of your thoughts around that. So if we'll sort of get into this first sort of question really is, what made you want to participate in the R&R project, and what did you want to get from it?
I think, I've always been about collaboration. The whole impetus behind education, or rather at the heart of education, is this idea that we're looking to build relationships through collaborative processes. And I think this has been such an incredible initiative because not only has it created a framework for that to happen, but it's encouraged that cross-pollination of ideas. So it was a no-brainer to get involved.
Fantastic. What yourself, Ellis?
Very similar. In fact, Clay said what I was going to say, which is I'm all about a collaboration. I love a collaboration. I like meeting new people. One thing I love about working at UWE is almost if you walk around campus, you physically and metaphorically, academically, fall over yourself sometimes on some days, finding opportunities to collaborate with partners. So whether it's doing this or participating in some of the Anthony Hill initiatives where there's one-on-one sessions, I first found it really enjoyable when I first joined UWE and started my PCAT, my postgraduate teaching qualification, small groups of other like-minded people, new teachers, just exchanging ideas. Oh, I did this, I did that. So as well as the collaboration and meeting new people, developing relationships, I like that creativity, particularly spontaneous creativity, which I think you get with face-to-face interactions. So all of the above, plus creative spontaneity, I'd say, was things that motivated me to get involved.
Fantastic. And
I was just going to say, it's been my experience sometimes that, as educators, we can get caught up, with the location-specific work that we're involved in. And what this has provided is that impetus to share those ideas, not just across departments, but across the entire institution. And I just thought it's just fantastic because we would never have gotten together to do work because there's such almost a disconnect between the things that we do professionally speaking, and yet we found so many similarities through this process.
We're here in S Block. Sometimes if I cycle in, I use the changing facilities. I've walked past this studio. I've never really known what it's for, but because of the scheme, I've met Clay and other colleagues and working together. So that was my motivation, and it was very enjoyable meeting another colleague who we've collaborated and shared information on other things about research. There was a paper we're trying to get published, and Clay gave me some links to some open access ones. So it's been more than the R&R scheme. We've become colleagues.
Yeah, fantastic. And obviously we gave out some themes of topics we wanted staff to explore. So whilst there was the autonomy to go off on your own direction. We gave some examples of things that staff might want to engage with, things like inclusive assessment. You guys selected digital education. What was the sort of interest around wanting to go down that particular theme?
Well, that's really at the heart of what I have always been involved in. So that was a bit of a no-brainer for me. And for you, similar?
Yeah, I mean, we'd come out of the pandemic, and as a result of, with most programs who pivoted to teach online, the program I was part of, we decided to deliberately refresh our program to be a hybrid program. So I'd learnt about how to live stream using Panopto and Collaborate and other platforms at university. And during that time of stuck at home, I kind of discovered the art, the beauty, the discovery of podcasts, which I'm sure we'll come on to. So I was kind of almost compelled to learn a lot more digital tools during the pandemic, and then found the real passion and joy of making podcasts, because they were collaborations, but also listening to podcasts, not just academic stuff. So I think they were the two drivers for me to choose digital education.
And I thought, I'm sure you found the same thing, that by creating a framework that, was there to guide the process, rather than to stipulate these are the steps that you need to follow to get through this process. Just having those parameters allowed for us, to freely navigate within that area. And so we used the exact same methodology when we were delivering to our students throughout the year. It was the case is, these are your guidelines, but feel free to engage anywhere within that space, and just giving people that freedom to be able to be creative within that space was really empowering.
I think there was something you said, Clay, and it's something I talk about with other colleagues, friends, my partner, in that how I think we felt, and correct me if I'm wrong, we had a consensus that we felt that the current model of delivery of sage on stage, sit in a classroom, so-called expert speaks, broadcast, publishes knowledge and information, and subjects absorb it, was quite a traditional model. And I think you used the analogy of, if you were to go in a time machine back 200 years, or if you lived 200 years ago and you went in a time machine forward 200 years and you walk past the classroom today, not much would have changed. And some cynics even argue that we've become even a bit more Victorian, particularly with primary and secondary education. So I think a personal motivator for me was to break out of this didactic delivery and something a bit more interactive, like a podcast, a bit more conversational, where, without getting too academic about the philosophies of teaching, students were much more equal with the teachers. And I think that's what we liked about digital education and podcasts. It can enable a bit more quality in the classroom and empower the student voice. So.
Yeah,
okay.
It's a shared experience, isn't it? That's what education's meant to be.
Completely.
And we just chose to use this digital platform to be able to do that.
And to expand upon that then, I suppose, having obviously mentoring the R&R groups, it's always an interesting start to the journey, because I always join the first meeting, do a round of introductions and intentionally leave before anything starts, because I don't want to shape any, the direction the conversation goes in. And I think that initially everyone finds that quite an awkward experience, but you're kind of forced to talk. And because you don't really know what one another is, what their role is, or what they teach, and what their sort of experience is, you're sort of forced to find out. And from those discussions is what kind of, what emerged then was these themes, and you got onto podcasts. So talk us through how that became the topic of conversation, and why that was the decision for you to research around that.
Well, I was going to say, I remember you leaving us, and I actually quite liked it.
Did it get a little awkward?
No, not for me. I mean, I liked it not because, oh, thank goodness James has gone. It was more, oh, okay, you've got the insight to see we've clicked, gel, we're getting on, and it was organic. But to answer your main question about how we got into podcasts, I felt it was a natural area of commonality that we have, because we've got slightly different roles. Obviously, our overall objective is to teach, train, educate, empower, enable. And I think there were some cross-cutting themes that I'm sure you'll come on to afterwards. There was a sustainability theme, because my background teaching is environmental health, prevention of ill health and trying to shape the environment. As I said earlier, I'd come from this kind of discovery of podcasts, of recording quite a few. So in the pandemic, I wouldn't say it's hundreds of hours, but recorded a lot of podcasts. And I enjoyed that journey of interviewing peers in the world of environmental health. So I had some experience of doing that. And it kind of, there was that commonality with Clay. And I think also having taught online and tried this hybrid course, I suppose, experiment we tried, I think we were both very much aware, and I'm putting words in your mouth for all this bit, Clay, we're both very much aware that there was still a need to empower and enable the student voice. So I think through these 3 or 4 themes I just mentioned, I recall that the outcome was, hey, let's do a podcast, and we get the students to be the, not be the content, but to host it, to drive it, and to share their experience, lived experiences of sustainability, education, well-being.
100% correct. And on digital learning design, the module that I was teaching on at the time, it was very much a case of empowering the students to be able to look at different platforms, to be able to deliver learning programs, and this idea about engaging with content in a way that's much more personal and meaningful to students. I mean, if you just compare how young adults are absorbing information through TikTok, through YouTube Shorts, it's, you know, short, snappy, little bits of information in an easily ingestible format. And so podcasts really do fit within that realm in terms of, you know, digital dissemination of information. Yeah. Something that's easily, believe it or not, in terms of a learning arc to get onboarded into using, but equally powerful, whether it's through visual media or just audio.
Yeah, I mean, just on that audio-visual thing, I became increasingly unfulfilled and found it more and more difficult physically and mentally to look at a screen, particularly during the pandemic, because we were communicating through Teams and doing a lot of online delivery. And I kind of found the podcast audio only attractive from my point of view. Particularly, I think, well, a student can listen to it when they're walking the dog or in their car, you know, like we listen to podcasts. But the other thing is, and just tapping on what Clay was saying about, you know, personal relationships, it being personal, is some people who do qualitative research talk about how qualitative research is all about that human relationship with the researcher and the participant. And, you know, I listen to other podcasts, for example, Leading with Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, and after listening to their podcasts over the last couple of years, I feel I've got to know them. And I think in a podcast, the listener, as well as learning stuff and engaging, and hopefully students producing their own podcast, you get to know the people, and that kind of tacit information, that kind of personal relationship, I think, for me, is just as valuable as content and knowledge generation.
100%. It's empowering the student voice, giving them agency, giving them control over that domain. How do you prove as a student that you've internalized something over a process? And perhaps engaging with that as a tool is just one of a multitude of opportunities to be able to, you know, show that you have.
Yeah, great. And so what was the project then? What did you set out to do? What was the,
that's a great question.
Yeah, because I appreciate that these
What was it?
Yeah, I appreciate that these things are quite abstract, and you know, it's just almost navigating and creating your own kind of structure around what it is you want to do. So where did it take you?
I think it was a little easier for me to be able to plug it into the work that we were doing, because as I said, with digital learning design, we were literally over that semester with year ones looking at different platforms to be able to, you know, disseminate information. And so we had podcasts on our journey. And then it involved, I suppose, a very easy process in terms of drawing on current resource to our technical teams in getting our students inducted on using the equipment. So we decided that we'd induct them on both cameras and audio recording devices. We booked time in the studio. We had a wonderful technical lead, Tom Baldry, take them through the studio, and we inducted them in the space. And then we had Phil Hargreaves take them around the campus using cameras, which was fantastic, because once they got equipment in their hands, I don't know what happens to a student's mind, but when you take them out of a classroom, they literally light up. And so they were all over the campus, running wild, recording everything. And you won't believe it, or you may well believe
Well,
it.
you've empowered and enabled them.
110%. They literally had to be dragged back in at the end of the day because they did not want to stop recording content.
And what was the kind of things they were recording, and where were like what?
That's a great question.
That's the creativity side of it.
So,
they had the sort of power to explore that creative side.
Exactly. So we did exactly the same thing you did with us. We decided we'd guide them with a few pertinent questions just to give them a direction as a starting point, as a platform, and then we said, just go wild. And they literally did. And by the end of the first induction day, which was very early on in the semester, they were making plans to start their own podcasts. They were talking about student voice. They were talking about EDI. They were talking about addressing issues in the SU. They were looking at using these new skills and this as a platform to be able to talk to anything and everything.
And didn't you have some connection with the UWE radio, the student, or something you?
That's right.
I recall something at the time.
100%. So the student union manages UWE's student presence when it comes to radio, and they were very kind enough to invite us along to be able to get our students onto the radio station, to get into the studio, and invited all of them to be a part of that process. It's voluntary based, and it's just a fantastic experience.
Yes.
The experience I had slightly different from Claire, and I think there's some work or discussion for us to have to compare notes of our different experiences as to why that is. But I certainly think for me and the programme I'm part of, and my colleagues there is a need to perhaps evaluate what happened and why. So there's two kind of, I suppose, headlines to my more specific experience. So here I have, for the last 10, 20 minutes, extolled the virtues of how great and wonderful podcasts are and how we can, enable and empower the student voice. So I suppose I was a bit naive. I thought, well, I just got to ask our students, and I put it out to 2 master's programmes, cohorts, whether they wanted to be involved. Didn't really get much appetite or buy-in, and tried to find out why, and spoke to a few students, and I still don't really know why. I mean, there wasn't appetite. There was a different dynamic and level of type of engagement with master's students. Some of them are in work, they have other commitments, but yeah, there wasn't really that appetite. And I thought, particularly because we had quite a broad, diversity of learning community on the programmes, with lots of international students, people from different backgrounds, I thought someone at least want to be involved and particularly tell their story of sustainability or well-being. We have lots of students who do research on the well-being of students compared to their housing conditions. So there's certainly some people making this active line inquiry about their experience. But anyway, I didn't really get many people from our programmes. And I remember speaking to Claire about this, and then one kind of idea that evolved from me thinking this would be really easy to do was adapting our assessment, or one of our assessments for one of our modules, particularly the environmental protection and sustainability module, which I'm one of the module leader for. And throughout my whole postgraduate teaching qualification experience, I really bought into this whole kind of radical collegiality, co-creation. So I thought, what a great idea. I'll change the assessment so that students they've got to create a podcast, not just going to stand up and do a presentation, they're going to do a podcast. And I think that's the next stage for me. It wasn't for lots of reasons they would do it this year. But I think there's potential for some of our students, and this was the grand vision that particularly that hasn't quite happened yet, is to try and not indoctrinate, but induct some of our master's students into the equipment, assimilation kind of phase. Here, this is how you can record a podcast, go out there and do it. And by the way, your assessment requires you to make a podcast. But currently, the contact time and classroom time that the master's students are on the campus doesn't really necessarily lend itself to, we are going to develop and teach and train and give you all the skills to record a podcast, and then we'll assess you on the content. So I think there's some evaluation for us to do, particularly on the appetite and buy-in from some of our students I contact. And there's some kind of, how can we create this co-creative podcast assessment, and what it would involve was, some of Clay's colleagues and team to to do some, teaching, I suppose, for a better word, for students how to record while and then. So that's, I suppose, the next conversation for us, because that didn't quite happen. But I'd like to do it because I love a co-creation, and I think that would empower and enable the student voice again.
Right. And do you think, during the evaluation, you'd be able to unpick, but some of the reasons why the take-up was slightly less. Do you think that's to do, there's the obvious synergies, teaching a digital education module within an education programme, obviously, and then I suppose bringing that into a discipline that wouldn't necessarily lend itself to digital efficacy in certain softwares. So there might be some, like say, some joining up to do, but it's interesting, isn't it? That's part of the process, isn't it? It's finding out the formula to get it right.
And there should be no reason why some of our master's students didn't. There shouldn't be a barrier to me. It is possible for this to be part of a module assessment. But there's some thinking to do on it. But I think you're right. There's some analysis and evaluation, and that's certainly the next stage for me, because I still want to change this assessment. So whether it's a podcast or whether it's whatever, it's a co-creation. And it may not even be digital, but that's what I want to do. Because again, in my postgraduate teaching career, that was, I wouldn't say rammed down our throats, we were taught that was a very valuable experience for students to participate in, and I've yet to curate that experience, and I want to.
Right.
I think what we found is that there's almost a fear, or at least a level of anxiety when it comes to multimodal assessment practices. I know the university's got this massive push towards inclusive education and assessment practices. And this does lean itself towards that, allowing a student to show whether they've understood something or a process using their own device is really empowering, let's be honest. But by the same token, you also build these enterprise skills, these productivity skills, these industry standard skills that enrich your student experience. So that's just massive, right?
Yeah, and if we rewind a couple of years, I had another module, a housing module, where students had to do a defended poster for their assessment, and I changed that to a pre-recorded Panopto video, and I had all those anxieties. What do you mean? There's some students, they'd never recorded anything, never used Teams, never used Panopto, or not used what's the one, Collaborate that we used to have, and that caused a great deal of anxiety. So I created some how-to videos, showed them how relatively easy I found it. So you're right, Clay, there is that anxiety. Oh my goodness, I've got to, as well as being assessed on my content, I've got to grapple with this new technology. But most people have a mobile phone, so maybe, and I'm doing my evaluation now, and I need to simplify the technology we suggest the students use. So rather than a high-tech, high-pressured studio, we just say, well, here's a cheap plug-in mic to your iPhone, two of you, because it's a paired presentation, have a conversation about X. So maybe that's something to consider.
And I suppose it's not just about allaying the fears of the academic, it's about allaying the fears of the student too, because when it comes to assessment, students become anxious regardless of the nature of the assessment. So I suppose the more we expose them to assessments in the sense of, we want you to have the experience of presenting, we want you to have the experience of creating an artifact, rather than saying we're going to tack on n number of assessments. If that could be built into the process in some way, shape or form, I think that's how you develop these core skills alongside of any of your graduate outcomes.
Yeah.
But a big question we've been getting when sort of presenting within our own areas is, it's all very well and good you're doing something that's innovative, that involves digital, but what sort of broad level support are we as academics going to get to be able to empower us to do the same thing? So these are some of the questions we're looking to have answered.
As well as the student anxieties, there are colleagues who equally have the same anxiety or, difficulty, apprehension with using different types of, whether it's technology or equipment. So I think, any support that helps a student or a member of staff to, come on, you can do this, it's Panopto or it's Teams, it is helpful, so yeah.
So the next steps then, I suppose, onto our sort of final part of this discussion, is where it goes from now on. So we've sort of touched upon that. I think some really interesting points have been made, especially around assessment. First of all, there is the use of podcasts or something similar for assessment, but how is that going to be enacted? How will that actually work? But second of all, there's lots of discussion at the moment around student choice assessment, and it's sort of adding a level of options, I suppose, optionality to students, because you could do a presentation in a different format. It's the formal presentation, I think, often stumps students, being in front of a screen or in front of a PowerPoint, in front of staff, having that really quite intimidating experience. Whereas having this conversation now, you soon forget that it's, a podcast, it's a conversation, isn't it? Yeah. So there's multiple layers of how this could be taken to the next, to be progressed within assessment, learning and teaching. So where would you like to see it go, or how would you like to take it places?
From a technical perspective, can I say the framework you've created here in the School of Education and Childhood is probably the blueprint framework for technical, instructional and digital support, because what we've created is this synergy between 3 teams essentially that work to support the academic process. So for me, it's about scaling that up because it works where you have these synergies between these 3 teams working collaboratively together towards that academic need. So as a benchmark standard, we need to ensure that these 3 professional services teams are working flawlessly to the same end and collaboratively. That for me has to be the starting point. Yeah. In terms of academic broadening, what do you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, anything that's accessible for staff to learn. So I recently visited an immersive showcase technology session down at Glenside, and there they were showcasing all this immersive technology and VR goggles, and I went along and I got some ideas, and I spoke to one of my colleagues there, and we said, maybe we can use it to mock up a kitchen inspection, because part of environmental health practice is to manage and regulate food safety. And that was an idea that we had, and I've involved the module leader, and the technology team there have made it very easy for my colleague to visit them and create this 2-dimensional immersive technology. So, and not all my colleagues would throw themselves into that if it wasn't made so easy. So I think some sort of, I don't want to say easy access, but accessible thing for staff. In terms of the students, I think there are lots of things for students to get into, throw themselves into, but one of their biggest limitations is time. So we're always saying, all these study skill sessions at the library. I'd love to add to that repertoire, that portfolio, how to record a podcast seminar, with Tom and Clay, whatever. It's down at S Block. Yeah. It's over lunchtime, 30 minutes. They'll lend you a cheap plug-in mic, record a podcast, and we'll publish it on Blackboard. Yeah. So I think I think what I'm saying is accessibility for staff to develop skills and students to give it a go.
Can I add to that? Because I think this is such an important point. And I've found that a lot of academics feel the same way, certainly the ones that I've spoken to. Students will only do what you tell them the module expects you to do. So if you invite them to do A, B, C, and D, and you say to them that this is up to you, 9 times out of 10, they're not going to engage with that, because they want to know that they're getting something out of that, whether it's a mark in an assessment, formative or summative. So I think part of the work that we could do, in particular as the digital learning service, is to help that process become embedded into learning design.
Yeah, I think learning and teaching is the other thing I was going to say. So we're talking more about summative assessment practice. What about how we could engage peer learning? It's almost like you're talking about 2 students, for example, could go off and research an activity, have a discussion around it with their lecturer, or have a discussion on their own, and that be a shared resource for the class to look at how they could peer learn from different sorts of activity that's going on. So it seems like there's no shortage of opportunities. I've written several down while we're having a chat.
I quite like the idea of optionality. So, and this is blue sky thinking and would create lots of work and time. But potentially, for one particular module assessment where it's a presentation, the students have the choice: stand up in front of the panel, record it on Panopto, or record the podcast. So maybe, because I think Clay's right, unless it's timetabled, and something some of my colleagues say was, or people say to me, will I fail the module if I don't do X? And you're like, Well, of course you won't, but it's really good learning experience, and it will help you in your career. It's like, well, okay, I'm not doing that. So if it could be an assessment option, and then you deliver the same content, but you choose the medium, and then you're going to have less kind of I'm being recorded kind of anxiety.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think an important point to make also is that, you know, on the one hand, we are expecting of our academics now that they expand the nature of their digital skills, right?
Yeah.
That is the new benchmark standard. You now not only are you expected to be the holder of knowledge within your subject area, but you're also expected to be a digital expert in many regards.
And a question for another podcast is, how do you do that? So if you're uncomfortable, unfamiliar, not confident, it's not your bag, how do you encourage and support staff to learn and throw themselves into learning new technology?
Exactly.
But I won't start to answer that question now, but I think that's the subject for another podcast. Because Clay's hitting the nail on the head. Not everyone wants to, but there is this expectation that one does. And some of my colleagues across the university, it is their thing, and for others it's not. They're better and more confident at other things. So it's a really good question.
Yeah.
It'd be really great to, obviously we're looking at running a series of podcasts, to put that out as an expression of interest for people from both sides, really, to sort of have that conversation, see if we can find sort of common ground, and if we can explore it a little further. Okay, well let's sort of consider bringing things to an end, and thank you. And just, I suppose, just to add, we've obviously got another 7 R&R groups, so each journey is uniquely, you know, its own entity in itself, you know, so we're hopefully going to have some more of those conversations with other groups, because obviously working with them individually, they've been on all very similar but very different journeys. In fact, that sort of learning, that exploration of how to do something. Some people have chosen to produce research projects and have recently presented at the Advanced HE conference, and others like yourself have done a much more action research focused learning and teaching initiative, you know, so there's multiple sort of outputs of this, and I'm looking forward to sort of exploring them. But thank you very much for your time, and look forward to working with you on this in the future.
Absolutely.
Great.
It's been a great experience.
It has. No, thank you.